Good afternoon. It's my pleasure again to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here for my third year, so hopefully these are helpful lectures. This year I decided to share with you some very new and emerging topics in both epilepsy and later today about pediatric neuromuscular diseases. And this topic has had a huge amount of news one today, which is cannabinoid oil or CBD for epilepsy in the United States as well as the rest of the world. And one of the things I spend a lot of time every day in my clinic just talking to families about this because I hear so much from the newspapers and the media. And I want to share information with you, what this is, what it's not, kind of cut through some of the hype that's out there and hopefully use this information because as I'll show you, there's actually, unlike many things in medicine or excitement of what we call snake oil, there's actually very good information, scientific basis for what we'll talk about today. And it's important to know what we know and what we don't know, as Dr. Guthrie talked the other day, or the other talk about this. So, and it's just not working, no problem. So the marijuana plant, I'll make my best to say several times, we're not talking about really marijuana, we're talking about CBD oil, the chemical constituent derived from the hemp plant shown there. But we joke about this and talk about it, and families talk about it. You cannot remove the connection between marijuana and CBD oil, but again, several times we'll say that we're talking about this particular molecule, CBD, which is different than THC or tetrahydrocannabinoid, which is the part that is psychoactive and gets you high, if you will. So again, my objectives today is to talk really about this tension that will be coming here, I'm sure, if it's not already, and hype versus reality, what do we know, what we don't know. And then this whole topic, of course, is colored by various political, legal, religious, ethical considerations, which makes it messy, but also, I think, very interesting. Again, there's really good data here. So this is just an example of things we have to deal with in the United States, because this is also a big business. There's a lot of people selling these products for profit, and many, many different products are out there. And as physicians, we don't often know, and neither does the patients and their families, what's in these products, what they're getting, and it's getting ridiculous. Like, this is the real scientific hemp oil, so that must be good. And then hempy was shown. This is some pizza sauce with CBD oil in it you can get. This would be my favorite, which is some dark chocolate with almonds. And then just to be contemporary, just this week in the United States Academy Awards, the Oscars, some of the people there were recommending putting CBD oil on their feet to help with their shoes during the long show. So again, it's just getting a little crazy, but if you get rid of all the craziness, there is something here to talk about. So cannabis sativa is the natural hemp plant, which all the things I'm talking today, by the way, are all natural plant purified substances. There is synthetic versions of these, but everything here is plant derived. And on the left is the molecular structure of tetrahydrocannabinoid or THC. Again, psychoactive, gets you high, forget about it now. But CBD on the right is one of the constituents of the same plant. As you can see, it's chemically different and interacts with the CB receptors in our brain quite differently. There's a lot of pharmacology here, but what I want you to show, most importantly, if just contrasting two molecules, is the CB1 receptor, highlighted in yellow there, is different action of THC and CBD. That's why we think the CBD oil is not psychoactive. So long history throughout the world of CBD and cannabinoid and marijuana as a medicine listed here. Thousands of years of history throughout the world. People have recognized this plant. They have medicinal properties. And then in the early 20th century in the United States, these were actually then used and marketed as drugs by different companies. But then there was a huge backlash against marijuana and drugs in general. In the United States, this was part of the Prohibition era where alcohol was banned and many other drugs. And this is a complicated history. But as you can see here from the movies, there was various political things going on as well. But it pretty much pushed out all these as medical value. Though it was and actually I think this is funny, the reason it really went away is that when this law was passed, physicians were still allowed to prescribe these drugs, but they had to pay a tax. And of course, if we ever have to pay taxes, we don't want to do it anymore. So that effectively killed marijuana type prescribing for medical purposes in the United States for about 70 years. And then there is concern about if you smoke marijuana, there is long-term health effects. Again, we're not talking about smoking marijuana, but there is some literature out there that's mixed in terms of safety long-term, especially in the younger developing brain. So, and then the last thing I'll mention about THC is a little bit silly, all this debate we have about CBD versus THC, because I can actually prescribe THC in the United States now. It's an FDA-approved drug for anti-nausea. So the idea that CBD should or not be approved was a big discussion, and we could already prescribe the stuff we don't want to talk about, which is stuff that gets you high. Anyway, so moving beyond the hype, what is the evidence we have that CBD is something that's important? Again, I'm going to focus very much today on what the data shows us, which is for childhood epilepsy, bad seizure disorders. And I've given talks here in years past about various types of bad seizure disorders. And I'm not going to talk anything about, name your field, fill in the blank. CBD oil may be considered for any medical consideration. We'll see what the data takes us when we get to that point. But the basic science here is known, like any drug that works on our body, it's because there are receptors in our body, in this case our brain, that respond to these drugs. So there's something called endocannabinoids, which are those substances that our brains normally make to help modulate our behavior and learning. And what CBD does is binds to these same receptors, and they're called CB1 and CB2. And forget about CB2 for this talk, that's an immune system modulator, but CB1 receptor is what these drugs bind to in the brain and has their effect, we think, for epilepsy. And if you want to just look at the cellular mechanism, it's thought that the neurotransmitters released from this neuron, for example, then cross to this part of a neuron. The CB receptors function here to modulate the uptake of the neurotransmitter, which will then change how the synapse functions and how these neurons will talk to each other, is essentially what we think is going on. But again, you can really look at the expression of these different factors and how these drugs bind to these real receptors and how they function. So there's good science and pharmacology behind it. I'm not going to talk about animal trials, but animal studies of epilepsy have been done extensively, and it's very clear from those that CBD as a substance can help prevent seizures in the animal models. So from this, we started having families take CBD oil that was made in different parts of the United States, different parts of the world, and just anecdotally give it to their children with seizures. And they started reporting very positive effects. And as you may know, that Colorado, as the last talk was mentioning, is one of the centers in the United States of CBD oil because it's available there readily. So there were different studies we were doing. This one survey of people in Colorado taking CBD oil showed that they thought that their children had a very good effect from taking CBD oil and not a lot of negative side effects. So this is encouraging, but again, it's not the level of evidence we require in medicine, which is really a randomized, placebo-controlled, blinded trial. What I thought was particularly interesting in this is, again, it gets at the hype. If they looked at parents who said that the CBD oil helped them, the greatest response to that was those families who physically moved from one part of the United States to Colorado thought it worked the best. So again, there's a lot of placebo effect here. A lot of people want this to believe. And while this is encouraging, we always keep in mind that it's difficult to study. And then one thing it shows here is that we just broke down in our own center at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, United States. We looked at our patients taking these CBD products. And in children, it was almost always for epilepsy, which again we'll talk about. But in adults, they'll take it for whatever you want listed there. And I'm not going to have any control or comment about that. But for the epilepsy portion in children, that's what most people were already taking it for. And within our population, I'm sorry, the graph didn't work well, we found that the dosing they were giving was relatively low, and partly because families have to buy the CBD oil out of pocket, and it costs hundreds of dollars per month for most families to buy CBD oil in the United States. And by the way, this is all before the FDA just recently approved a new drug called Epidiolex, which I'll talk about in a few slides, for epilepsy. So people were using it. They had some reasonable, they thought, positive effects, but they're also underdosing because they couldn't afford to give the right dose to get where they wanted to go because they had to pay for it. And then most of our families can use the Colorado products, but it came from all over the United States. And again, as practitioners, we had the challenge of not knowing exactly what our patients are taking, what's in it, how variable is it from month to month, and also the fact that it's illegal at this point in the United States, in many of these states, to use these drugs. In Tennessee, my home state, it is legal, so we had some legal space to talk to families about it, but it's a very difficult issue to get to. So along the time, a drug company in the United Kingdom, GW, was developing a form of cannabinoid oil, CBD, that was still plant-derived but highly, highly purified with the intent of making this a drug that could be marketed in the United States and throughout the world eventually. And like any CBD oil we want to use, it has to be very low in THC. So this is, again, not psychoactive. It's still plant-derived, I mentioned. And through some studies, I'll just share some of the data with you. The FDA last year, but just the last 2 months, the drug has hit the market, approved it for 2 very bad epilepsy syndromes called Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, essentially intractable seizure disorders in children. And EU approval has been applied for, and as far as I can tell, it's coming very soon. And I don't think it's available anywhere in this region of the world yet, but I assume it'll be coming too, because GW Pharma has worldwide ambitions for this market. And I used to think these drugs were very expensive, but compared to some of the talks we heard earlier today, they're not that expensive. It's about $32,000 US per year for this drug. And while that is incredibly expensive, it helps with seizures we'll tell you about, and most of the time the US insurance will pay for it with some encouragement. So there were definitely good science that was done. Phase 3 trials were done, and they showed a dramatic effect that was positive. I'll show you some of the data. And while there's always side effects with any substance or drug, they were pretty well tolerated. And I tell families, compared to other drugs I prescribe for epilepsy that's used all the time, the Epidiolex, so far with our initial experience, seems to actually have less side effects overall. But it still has drugs, it still has side effects. The main one we found was that there's some liver issues with a small subset of patients. We'll check liver enzymes when we're starting this medication. But it's pretty minor so far. Here's some of the data supporting it. The placebo is in the gray bars, and this is looking at the reduction of seizures. So the higher the bar, the more reduction of seizures in this graph. And different types of seizures, drop seizures, total seizures are shown here. And different 2 doses of the Epidiolex are both effective. And the doses in the red is 10 milligrams per kilogram per day. And then the blue is 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. And the slide I showed you before, most of our patients were taking about 4 or 5 milligrams per kilogram per day. So substantially underdosing before, and with this higher dose, again, which patients did well, had the most efficacy. So this drug was approved by the FDA. And then the future steps is to really get it out there and be approved and be available for other purposes. We'll see next year or 2, I think, much wider regulatory approval. Again, it's expensive, but I don't think it's the most expensive thing out there yet. And what we need to do as practitioners is really, again, look at the objective evidence, so decrease the hype and increase the communication with families to what this is good for and what it's not good for. But again, I'm sure every field of medicine, people will have the question because people like the idea, patients like the idea that there's some natural substance out there that can be used. So I think we'll see more and more of the CBD family used as drugs in medicine, which is great. We need all the tools we can get. And then when I looked into it, just to have a little local connection, there's different regulatory and, like I said, there's political and religious and ethical things. But it seems to me that, and I talked about some at dinner last night, since CBD oil does not get you high, it's not psychoactive, it should be halal. Is that correct? Not haram, if people interpret this. So given that, I think it should be something that will be accepted in this community, and it's used, again, as a medical purpose. So I'll stop at that point and say thank you. I had a wonderful visit so far. Wait. This is, of course, Dr. Russell and his wife, Barbara. And we had a wonderful trip yesterday to the Dead Sea, so they're very happy me taking the picture. It was a little cold, but we still enjoyed it, so shukran lak.